The hotel lobby gleamed like a monument to wealth, polished floors reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers above. Cora Johnson, 62, smoothed down the red and white uniform she had earned in her latest job at the Regency Grand Hotel. Every crease in the fabric was meticulously pressed, her hair pinned back with practiced precision. Despite all these signs of care, she felt invisible in this place, as she had in many others. Years of labor in diners and modest hotels had led her here, not to retirement as she'd once hoped, but to start over again, this time in an establishment teeming with affluence. The buzz of early morning preparations filled the air as Cora moved down the service hallway, her steps unhurried but purposeful. Other staff members bustled past, exchanging hushed greetings. Despite working together each day, they'd rarely paused long enough to exchange names or stories. Survival in a world of quickened demands, tight schedules, and even tighter budgets. Cora found comfort in their silent camaraderie, a quiet sense of unity in their shared work. After stocking her cart, she rolled it out of the supply closet and along the hallway, the thick carpet muffling the wheels. Cora could sense the anticipation among the staff. Whispers hinted that a significant guest would arrive today. She brushed off the rumors as just another shift, but a faint unease lingered. The hotel's grandeur felt almost ominous this morning, as if something unwelcome loomed just beyond her sight. Mid-morning came, and she found herself standing in the main hallway, eyes down, focused on her task of adjusting a flower arrangement by the elevator. Just then, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and out stepped a tall, elegantly dressed man with silver hair that spoke of wealth and power. This, she knew without a doubt, was the VIP guest, a name whispered but always in a tone just above a murmur. Reginald Blackwood II, a powerful businessman with a reputation that commanded immediate obedience. His gaze fell upon her, narrowing, as though she were an object that didn't quite fit in his field of vision. "You there," he barked, his tone a note short of dismissive. "My suite better be spotless. I don't tolerate mediocrity." Cora's instinctive reply was a quiet, "Yes, sir." She'd said those words countless times, to countless guests, but somehow, this felt different. She could feel the weight of his gaze, even as he walked past her, his entourage following like shadows. She released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Within moments, Mr. Thompson, her manager, appeared, a flush creeping over his face as he approached Cora. "Johnson," he hissed, "you're assigned to Mr. Blackwood's suite. He's our highest-profile guest, so I need you to be at your best. Don't disappoint." "Understood, sir." Cora nodded, despite the unease tightening in her stomach. She cleaned suites like his before, managed high-profile guests, yet the intensity in Thompson's voice told her Blackwood was different. She felt an unusual weight of expectation, the silent understanding that any misstep would reflect poorly not only on her but on the hotel. She straightened her spine and set off toward the VIP floor, one step at a time. Inside the wine cellar, Cora carefully selected the bottle Mr. Blackwood had requested, aware of the quiet hum that settled over the place. She cradled the bottle with care, feeling the cool glass and acknowledging its worth, more than her weekly pay. Returning to her station, she polished a crystal glass and arranged it on the tray, her practiced hands steady despite the anxiety lingering beneath. The clock ticked closer to Mr. Blackwood's requested time, and Cora steeled herself, her fingers brushing her uniform one last time. Everything needed to be perfect. She balanced the tray and walked down the carpeted hall toward his suite, each step as measured as her breaths. The door loomed, its ornate gold handle gleaming in the light, a barrier between her world and his. With a final inhale, she knocked, the sound disappearing into the hushed silence of the VIP floor. "Enter," came his command, crisp and unmistakable. Cora pushed open the door, and a view she'd only ever glimpsed in passing stretched before her. The suite was a study in opulence. Golden light spilled through grand windows, casting shadows across plush carpets and walls adorned with fine art. It was a world away from the modest rooms she had lived in, yet it offered her no comfort. Instead, the vastness felt cold, isolating. Mr. Blackwood lounged in a leather armchair, exuding a sense of unearned ease. His gaze shifted to her, as if inspecting an unfamiliar artifact. She set the tray down gently on the marble-topped table beside him. "Your wine, sir," she said quietly, averting her eyes, as expected. The afternoon stretched on, minutes melting into hours as Cora moved through the hotel's many corridors and rooms. Every task, from fluffing pillows to shining bathroom fixtures, became a blur of practiced motions. Yet, in the back of her mind, the weight of Mr. Blackwood's words and the memory of his disdain clung like an unwelcome shadow. She tried to push it aside, focusing on each task as a way to ground herself. But her hands shook slightly, an unusual sign of distress in someone as seasoned as she was. By late afternoon, Cora found herself in a small break room tucked away from the guests' prying eyes. She poured herself a cup of tea, savoring the warmth in her hands, hoping it might ease the chill his words had left behind. The room was empty except for Juanita, a younger maid who worked the night shift. With her curly hair and bright eyes, Juanita was a breath of fresh air in the often solemn staff quarters. She noticed Cora's tense expression and tilted her head sympathetically. "Long day?" Juanita asked, folding her arms as she leaned against the counter. Cora offered a weary smile. "You could say that. Mr. Blackwood is demanding." Juanita's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, I heard about him. Word is he's difficult with everyone." She gave a low whistle. "Guess it's not an exaggeration, huh?" Cora shrugged, not willing to give away the specifics but finding some comfort in Juanita's knowing nod. "Just part of the job, I suppose," she said, though the words rang hollow. She had spent years enduring difficult customers, entitled guests, and unkind words. But there was something particularly piercing about Blackwood's tone, the way he looked at her as if she were no more than a smudge on his pristine life. Juanita sighed, looking at her with a sympathy only someone else in the service industry could offer. "It's just not right, Miss Cora. No one should treat you that way, especially not someone who probably hasn't worked a day in his life." Cora forced a laugh, but she felt the weight of truth in Juanita's words. "I've had worse, believe me. I just have to remember that these guests come and go. They forget us the minute they leave the hotel." Juanita gave her an encouraging pat on the shoulder. "Well, if you ever want to vent, I'm here. We all need a little support now and then, right?" "Thank you, Juanita." Cora nodded gratefully, finding solace in the girl's kindness. But as she returned to her duties, a question lingered in her mind. When had she last truly leaned on someone for support? The realization stung. She'd carried the weight of her own burdens for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to share them. As evening approached, Cora made her way back to Mr. Blackwood's suite. He had sent for her again, and her heart sank with a mix of dread and resignation. She arrived at his door and took a deep breath, steeling herself before raising her hand to knock. "Enter," came the curt response, his tone as clipped and dismissive as before. Cora stepped inside and immediately noticed a stack of papers on the table, a laptop open beside them. Blackwood sat behind the desk, but his eyes were on her before she could even speak. "I need these delivered to the business center downstairs," he said without looking up, waving his hand dismissively. "Now." She nodded, reaching for the papers, when he suddenly looked up. "Careful," he snapped. "I'd rather not have these documents mangled by someone who doesn't know the value of precision." Cora's face flushed, but she kept her expression neutral. She nodded and carefully gathered the papers. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, and then he leaned back in his chair, a hint of a smirk tugging at his mouth. "Tell me, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice carrying an edge of mocking curiosity, "how is it that someone of your stature finds herself in a place like this? Don't you have dreams of retiring, of enjoying whatever it is you people do in your twilight years?" The question caught her off guard. She felt a flash of anger, but kept her voice steady. "I enjoy working, sir," she replied, her tone measured. "I find purpose in what I do." Purpose. Blackwood let out a laugh, cold and sharp. That's what they all say, isn't it? Purpose. He leaned forward, his gaze cutting into her. There's no purpose here, Miss Johnson. There's simply the reality that you serve, and I don't. She gritted her teeth, her hands tightening around the stack of papers. But she said nothing, her silence a testament to the restraint she had learned over decades. As she turned to leave, she heard him mutter something under his breath, a word that sent a chill down her spine. Pathetic. The walk to the business center felt longer than it should have. Each step weighed heavier, each corridor seemed to stretch farther. She dropped off the documents, exchanged a few polite words with the receptionist, then turned back toward the service elevator, the weight of Mr. Blackwood's words sinking deep into her heart. Returning to her cart, she resumed her routine, each task serving as a distraction, a temporary balm for the sting of his words. It wasn't until she reached the last guest room on her list, a corner suite on the 22nd floor, that she finally allowed herself to stop, leaning against the wall and closing her eyes. Her mind drifted to memories of the past, of days when her children were young, their laughter filling the small apartment. How had those years slipped by so quickly, leaving her here with only silence and strangers who would never know her name? The soft chime of the elevator doors down the hall broke her reverie. She opened her eyes to see Mr. Thompson, the hotel manager, striding toward her. His face was set in a frown, his gaze sweeping over her with the same impatience she had seen earlier. "Cora," he began, his voice hushed but tense, "we've had a complaint. Mr. Blackwood feels you're not attentive enough. He specifically mentioned that you should be more presentable when serving VIPs." The words stung. She'd spent her entire life honing her professionalism, her quiet dignity, her attention to detail. And yet, here she was, being reprimanded for her appearance, her age, her very presence. "I understand, sir," she replied softly, though every word felt like a stone in her throat. Mr. Thompson gave a reluctant nod. "Just try to be more mindful. We don't want to lose his business." As he walked away, Cora felt a rush of bitterness. It wasn't about her at all. It was about keeping Mr. Blackwood comfortable, preserving the reputation of the hotel. She was simply a means to an end, an accessory to the luxury experience he demanded. The rest of her shift passed in a haze, the final tasks dragging by as her thoughts turned inward. The image of herself as a young woman, proud and strong, was a far cry from the reflection she saw now in the hallway mirrors, a reflection she hardly recognized anymore. She had weathered decades of hardship with dignity, but now she felt that dignity slipping, pulled apart by the small, constant humiliations of her job. As the clock neared midnight, Cora returned to the service quarters, exhausted but too weary to rest. She sat at a bench in the corner of the break room, gazing blankly at the lockers lining the wall, her mind numb with fatigue. For a moment, she allowed herself to wonder, was this truly all there was left for her? Just as she was gathering her things to leave, she noticed a slip of paper taped to her locker door. It was a note, written in the familiar looping scrawl of one of the younger maids. "Remember, Miss Cora, you're stronger than they know." The words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within her. She took a deep breath, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. She was stronger, and she had weathered far worse storms. Tomorrow, she would return, her spirit renewed by that small reminder of her own resilience. As she left the hotel, stepping out into the cool night air, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. There was a quiet strength building within her, a resolve she hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, she would face Mr. Blackwood again, but this time, she wouldn't allow his words to define her. In that moment, under the blanket of stars, Cora felt the stirrings of a fire that even Blackwood's cruelty couldn't extinguish. Cora returned to work the next morning with a quiet resolve. Her evening walk home had given her time to process the events of the day, and by morning, her inner resolve had solidified. She would not let the likes of Reginald Blackwood define her worth. She had faced far worse in her life, and each scar had strengthened her. This time would be no different. The day began as most others, with Cora organizing her cleaning cart, checking that she had the fresh linens, cleaning supplies and amenities needed to meet the hotel's exacting standards. She moved swiftly, completing room after room, her hands steady and quick. The muscle memory of a lifetime of hard work guided her movements, and as she worked, she found herself sinking into the familiar rhythm. Around mid-morning, she received a message from her supervisor, instructing her to bring a tray of breakfast to Mr. Blackwood's suite. She took a steadying breath, loading the tray with the finest breakfast the hotel offered. Fruit carved into delicate shapes, eggs prepared precisely to order, fresh croissants that had come out of the oven moments ago, and an espresso poured with a layer of perfect foam. As she walked through the hallway leading to Blackwood's suite, she reminded herself that this was simply another task, another guest. She knocked, and after a brief pause, his sharp command came through the door. "Come in." The suite looked just as lavish and pristine as it had yesterday, sunlight spilling across the plush carpets and illuminating the city view beyond. Blackwood was seated at a table, papers spread out before him as he spoke on his phone in a low, clipped tone. He didn't acknowledge her as she approached, setting the breakfast tray on the table beside him. She stood back, waiting for him to complete his conversation, her hands folded neatly in front of her. He ended the call and finally turned his attention to her. "The eggs better be done the way I specified," he said coldly, picking up his fork and inspecting the food as though it might harbor some hidden flaw. "Yes, sir," Cora replied, her voice steady. She watched as he tasted a bite of the eggs, his expression shifting to one of faint approval. "Mom," he muttered, cutting another piece. He glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing. "At least you can follow simple instructions." Cora suppressed the urge to respond, holding her silence as she had done countless times before. But Blackwood seemed discontent with her silence today. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he regarded her. "Tell me, Miss Johnson," he began, his voice thick with mockery, "do you ever get tired of this life? Serving others, cleaning their messes, living in the shadows of people like me?" Cora took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "I take pride in my work, sir," she replied, her voice low but firm. He scoffed, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Pride? Is that what you tell yourself? That scrubbing floors and delivering breakfast is something to take pride in?" Her jaw clenched, but she remained outwardly calm. "I believe any job done well is worth pride, sir." His smirk faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "Spare me the lecture, Miss Johnson. You're here because you have no choice, because people like me control what people like you can and cannot have. And you might want to remember that before you go around boasting about pride." Cora's hands trembled, but she kept them at her sides, her chin held high. She knew better than to argue with him, knew that any words would only add fuel to his scorn. Instead, she simply nodded, her silence more powerful than any retort. Seemingly unsatisfied with her lack of reaction, Blackwood shook his head in frustration and gestured toward the door. "You're dismissed." As she turned to leave, a sense of shame and indignation warred within her. Blackwood's words echoed in her mind, but so too did the small note Juanita had left for her, reminding her of her own strength. She could feel Blackwood's eyes on her back as she walked out of the suite, his gaze like a weight pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let him see her falter. Once the door closed behind her, she released a long, slow breath, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed her cart down the hallway. Her chest felt tight, her thoughts swirling with a mix of anger and humiliation. But as she walked, she reminded herself of the resilience she had built over a lifetime of hard work. She was not defined by Blackwood's cruelty, nor by the limitations he sought to impose on her. The remainder of the day passed slowly, each task feeling heavier than usual. By late afternoon, Cora found herself in the hotel's small employee lounge, seeking a few moments of quiet before her next assignment. She sat on a worn armchair in the corner, staring out the window as the city moved in the distance. She felt an overwhelming sense of fatigue, not just in her body, but in her spirit. The years had worn her down, and while she had always taken pride in her ability to endure, she now felt the weight of that endurance pressing down on her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, and she looked up to see her friend Anita, one of the other senior housekeepers, standing in the doorway. Anita's warm smile and kind eyes had been a source of comfort for Cora since her first day of the hotel, and today her presence felt like a balm on Cora's weary heart. "Cora, I heard you had to deal with Mr. Blackwood again today," Anita said gently, taking a seat beside her. "That man has a reputation, you know. You're not the first to be on the receiving end of his cruelty." Cora sighed, nodding. "I know, but it doesn't make it any easier." Anita placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than he is, Cora. Don't ever forget that. He may have money and power, but he doesn't have your strength, your dignity. You've built a life from nothing, and he can't take that away from you." Cora felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back, giving Anita a grateful smile. "Thank you, Anita. Sometimes I just need to be reminded." Anita squeezed her shoulder gently. "Anytime, my friend. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all here for you." Cora's spirits lifted slightly as she returned to her work, Anita's words echoing in her mind. She had spent so many years carrying her burdens alone that she had forgotten the comfort of companionship, the strength that could be found in the support of others. She resolved to lean on that support, to find strength not only in herself, but in the friendships she had cultivated over the years. As she moved through the hotel's upper floors, she began to feel a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination that had been buried beneath the weight of Blackwood's insults. She was more than a maid, more than a servant. She was a woman of resilience, a survivor of life's many trials. And while Blackwood may have wealth and influence, she had something far greater, a strength forged through hardship, a dignity that could not be easily shaken. Later that evening, Cora was assigned to clean one of the luxury suites on the top floor, a task that she approached with her usual diligence. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, a small, simple melody that brought her comfort. She was lost in her work, her thoughts calming, when the door to the suite suddenly opened. She turned, startled, to see Mr. Blackwood standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her with a look she couldn't quite decipher. Her heart skipped a beat, a flash of fear running through her as she wondered if she had somehow displeased him again. "Cora," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. The cold arrogance that usually marked his tone was absent, replaced by something almost contemplative. She straightened, unsure of what to expect, but prepared to face whatever words he had for her. Blackwood cleared his throat, his gaze shifting to the floor. He paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "I wanted to. Thank you. The breakfast this morning was well done." Cora blinked in surprise, taken aback by the unexpected softness in his voice. She had never heard him speak with anything close to gratitude, and the sound of it was jarring. "Thank you, sir," she replied, keeping her tone polite but guarded. He nodded, his gaze still focused on the floor. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them replaced by an awkwardness that was equally uncomfortable. Blackwood cleared his throat again, looking up at her with a hint of something almost vulnerable. "Good night, Miss Johnson," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned and left the room, leaving Cora standing there, bewildered and unsure of what to make of the encounter. She watched the door close behind him, her mind racing as she tried to understand what had just happened. Had she seen a glimmer of humanity in Reginald Blackwood? Or was it merely a fleeting moment, a lapse in the mask he wore so carefully? Cora shook her head, dismissing the thought. Whatever his reasons, she knew better than to trust them. She had seen too many people like him, people who took and took, only to turn their backs on those who served them. But as she finished her work and prepared to leave for the night, She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something subtle yet undeniable. Tomorrow would bring a new day, and with it, another chance to face whatever challenges awaited her. And this time, she would face them with her head held high, her spirit unbroken, and her resolve stronger than ever. Cora awoke the next morning with the remnants of a strange feeling lingering from the night before. The unexpected exchange with Mr. Blackwood weighed on her thoughts, occupying her mind as she moved through her morning routine. His expression had been almost soft, human even, as though there was something more beneath the cold exterior he presented to the world. But she quickly brushed the thought aside. She had learned over her many years that the wealthy rarely showed kindness without a hidden motive. Her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser showed a face marked by experience and endurance, and her eyes held the same quiet strength that had carried her through countless hardships. She took a deep breath, smoothing her uniform and preparing herself for another day in the opulent halls of the Regency Grand Hotel. The hotel was bustling as she arrived, the usual early morning rush of guests checking out and others arriving. She pushed her cart down the hallway, exchanging polite nods with the other staff members. Her heart raced slightly as she approached Mr. Blackwood's suite, unsure of what awaited her. She hadn't been summoned yet, but her manager, Mr. Thompson, had mentioned that she might be assigned to his suite again today. The thought brought a mix of dread and curiosity. After handling her first few rooms, she received the call she was half expecting. Mr. Thompson's voice was sharp, cutting through the morning like a blade. "Cora, Mr. Blackwood requested a bottle of Chateau Margaux from the cellar, served with the utmost care. I want you to handle it personally. No mistakes." "Understood, sir," she replied, though the anxiety gnawed at her. Chateau Margaux was one of the hotel's finest and most expensive wines, a vintage worth more than her monthly pay. Handling such a delicate task was an honor for most staff members, but with Blackwood, she knew it was more likely another test, a challenge to see if she would falter. She made her way to the wine cellar, a quiet, dimly lit sanctuary tucked deep within the hotel. The air was cool and filled with the rich scent of oak and aged grapes. Cora took her time selecting the wine, her hand steady as she located the Chateau Margaux bottle. Nestled among rows of other fine vintages, she cradled it carefully, as though holding a piece of fragile history, and placed it gently on her serving tray. With the wine in hand, she moved back upstairs, her footsteps measured, each step a reminder of her careful professionalism. At the door to Blackwood's suite, she took a calming breath and knocked. "Come in," he called, his voice carrying a weariness that was unusual for him. Cora entered, balancing the tray as she walked into the room. Blackwood was seated in a high-backed chair near the window, his usual aura of command muted as he gazed out over the city. He looked almost tired, his shoulders sagging slightly, his usually impeccable posture relaxed. She set the tray down on the side table beside him and poured a glass, the deep red liquid shimmering in the morning light. She was about to step back when his voice broke the silence. "Sit," he said, his tone softer than usual, though it still held the edge of command. Cora hesitated, uncertain if she had heard him correctly. She had never been invited, no, ordered, to sit by a guest before, especially not one as demanding as Blackwood. But his gaze softened slightly, and he nodded toward the chair across from him. Reluctantly, she took a seat, her posture rigid, hands folded neatly in her lap. She kept her gaze lowered, unsure of what he expected from her in this strange, uncharted moment. Blackwood sipped the wine, savoring it with a slight sigh, then looked over at her, his expression unreadable. "Do you know much about wine, Miss Johnson?" She shook her head, finding her voice but keeping it quiet. "Not much, sir. Only what I've learned here at the hotel." He nodded, swirling the wine in his glass. "This," he said, holding the glass up to the light, "is one of the finest wines in the world. Every grape is carefully cultivated, aged to perfection, and bottled with the utmost care. A single bottle can cost thousands. He took another sip, his gaze distant. Cora waited, uncertain why he was telling her this. She glanced at the door, wondering if she would be reprimanded for her unusual presence here, but something in Blackwood's demeanor held her in place. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone softer. "It's strange, isn't it, that people would pay so much for something so fleeting? A taste, a moment of indulgence, gone in a single sip." He let out a dry chuckle. "The things people think matter, the things they spend their lives chasing, power, wealth, status. In the end, it's all just meaningless." Cora couldn't hide her surprise. This was a different man than the one who had mocked her the day before. His words, though cynical, carried a weight of sorrow she hadn't expected. She shifted in her seat, feeling an uncharacteristic urge to speak. "If you'll forgive me, sir," she said carefully, "I think it's the people who make life meaningful, not the things." She kept her gaze on her folded hands, unsure if he would tolerate such boldness from her. Blackwood looked at her, his brow furrowing as though her words had struck a chord. He didn't respond immediately, instead taking another sip of his wine. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I used to believe that. I used to think that if I had enough money, enough success, it would fill whatever was missing." He paused, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. "But the more I have, the emptier it feels." The days after her quiet exchange with Mr. Blackwood held a curious shift for Cora. She went about her duties with the same diligence and care as before, but she couldn't shake the sense that her world, once limited to the predictable rhythm of the hotel's hallways and rooms, had subtly widened. For years, she had accepted her invisibility, embracing the role of quiet servitude, but now she felt a stirring within her, a reminder of her own dignity. Her encounter with Blackwood, both the cruel words he'd once thrown at her and the unexpected moments of vulnerability he'd shown afterward, had left a mark on her. And while she could not quite decipher the feeling, she recognized that something in him had shifted too, an awareness she sensed each time their paths crossed. One morning, she was surprised to see Mr. Blackwood standing alone by the hotel's grand windows overlooking the city, his eyes lost in thought. He didn't summon her, nor did he acknowledge her presence, but there was something about his stillness that caught her attention. His usual entourage was absent, and his face, usually hardened and stern, appeared strangely softened. She lingered a moment, observing him from the periphery of the lobby, before continuing on her way, her own heart heavier with questions. Later that day, Cora received another unusual request. Blackwood had ordered her to bring afternoon tea to his suite, something that was typically the duty of the hotel's dining staff. She felt a flicker of anxiety as she prepared the tea, wondering if this was another test, another way to exert his control. She carried the tray up to his suite, balancing it with the practiced care she'd learned over the years. The door opened at her soft knock, and Blackwood stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. She noticed immediately that he was alone, without his usual assistants hovering nearby, their tablets ready to take down his commands. She set the tray down on the small side table, pouring a cup of tea and arranging the china precisely, her movements fluid. "Thank you, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. He waited until she finished arranging the tea before he gestured to the seat across from him, just as he had done days before. Cora hesitated, but his expression was unreadable, his gaze focused on some distant point outside the window. She took a seat, her posture cautious and reserved, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Do you know what day it is, Miss Johnson?" he asked suddenly, his gaze still fixed on the city skyline. She blinked, caught off guard by the question. "It's Tuesday, sir." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Not what I meant," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It's the anniversary of my father's death. 4 years today." She was taken aback, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected this revelation, hadn't imagined that the impenetrable Mr. Blackwood would confide in her. But she understood loss, the heaviness of anniversaries that carried the weight of memories and regret. She stayed silent, allowing him the space to continue if he wished. "My father built everything," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "This hotel, the empire I run now, all of it was his. And all of it was given to me without question, as if I had done anything to deserve it." He paused, his gaze distant, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his chair. "And now, all of it feels so hollow. I don't know if I even want it." His voice wavered, revealing an edge of vulnerability she had never seen. Cora's heart ached at the sadness in his voice. She remembered his harsh words from days before, the way he had belittled her, dismissed her as unworthy of his respect. And yet here he was, stripped of his armor, revealing a truth he likely hadn't shared with anyone else. She searched for words, unsure of what to say to a man who had once mocked her for her place in the world. "You know," she began softly, her voice steady but warm, "I've spent my whole life working in places like this, always in the background, always watching people come and go. I've learned that no amount of wealth can fill the emptiness left by loss. Money may buy you things, but it can't heal you. Only people, connections, can do that." Blackwood looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes seemed to soften, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "You sound like you know this from experience." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I do, sir. I lost my husband many years ago, and for a long time, I thought that working, keeping busy, would keep the pain away. But no matter how much I worked, that emptiness remained, until I learned to let people in again, to allow myself to connect. It's not easy, but it's what makes us whole." A silence settled over the room, profound and unbroken. She hadn't expected to share such personal details, hadn't anticipated her own heart opening up in front of a man who had once seemed so unreachable. But his vulnerability had called forth her own, a shared understanding born of loss and resilience. Blackwood took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how to let people in," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've spent my whole life building walls, thinking they would protect me, make me strong. But they've only isolated me." Cora felt a pang of compassion for him, a man trapped in his own fortress, unable to reach beyond his wealth and power. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It's never too late to start, sir. Life has a way of surprising us, of bringing people into our lives when we least expect it." Blackwood met her gaze, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. He seemed on the verge of saying something more, something unguarded, when a knock at the door broke the quiet intimacy of the moment. One of his assistants entered, clipboard in hand, their eyes widening slightly at the sight of Cora seated across from him. Blackwood's expression hardened immediately, his guard slipping back into place. "That will be all, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice brisk and formal once more. Cora nodded, rising from her seat and giving him a respectful bow. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of his face, and in that brief moment, she saw the man he had revealed to her, a man yearning for connection, struggling to bridge the chasm he had created around himself. The rest of her shift passed in a blur, her thoughts drifting back to the conversation with Blackwood. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen a part of him no one else had, that she had glimpsed the heart of a man hidden beneath years of hardened armor. She found herself wondering what kind of life he might have led if he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to embrace the relationships he had pushed away. Late that evening, as she prepared to leave, she noticed a small envelope slipped under the door of her locker. Inside was a note, written in the same neat handwriting as before. "Your words today were comforting. Thank you." There was no signature, but she knew it was from him. She held the note in her hands, a small smile playing on her lips as she read and reread the words. It was a simple gesture, but it held a significance far beyond the few lines on the page. In that moment, she realized that she had, in some small way, made a difference in his life. The days that followed were quieter, marked by a strange sense of peace that settled over her. She went about her duties with a renewed sense of purpose, her steps lighter, her heart unburdened. She felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years, a quiet pride in knowing that her presence, her words, had left an impression on someone who had once dismissed her as invisible. But just as she began to embrace this newfound peace, life threw her an unexpected curve. On a quiet afternoon, she was called into Mr. Thompson's office, his face tight with worry. "Cora," he began, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "I don't know how to tell you this, but there's been a complication. Mr. Blackwood has been taken to the hospital. He collapsed this morning during a business meeting." The news hit her like a punch to the gut. She gripped the edge of the desk, her mind reeling. She hadn't imagined that she would feel this level of concern, but the thought of him, alone and vulnerable, filled her with a sense of urgency. Without thinking, she asked, "Which hospital? Is there any way I can go to see him?" Mr. Thompson looked at her, surprise flashing across his face before he nodded slowly. "He's at the city hospital, in the VIP ward. You could take the afternoon off if you need to. I know you two had some unusual interactions." Cora gave him a grateful nod, gathering her things quickly. As she left the hotel, her heart raced with worry and uncertainty. She wasn't sure what she would say, or if he would even want to see her, but she knew that she had to be there, to offer him the same strength and support he had so reluctantly accepted. And as she made her way to the hospital, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple out into the world, changing lives in ways she might never fully understand. The sterile lights of the hospital hallway cast a harsh glow over everything, making the world feel both hyperreal and distant at once. Cora gripped her purse tightly, her fingers brushing the small note Blackwood had left her. It was a simple piece of paper, yet it reminded her of the unexpected connection they had formed, an unlikely bond between a maid and a millionaire, each carrying their own silent burdens. She approached the reception desk, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked for his room number. The nurse gave her a curious look before pointing her down the hallway to the VIP ward. Cora took a deep breath, her nerves fluttering as she made her way through the hospital's maze of corridors. When she finally reached his room, she stood outside the door for a moment, gathering her courage. She had no idea what she would say or if he would even want to see her. But something told her that, in his time of need, he might appreciate a familiar face, however unexpected. Gently, she knocked on the door and waited, her heart racing as the seconds ticked by. A voice from inside beckoned her in, and she stepped into the room, her gaze falling on Blackwood lying on the hospital bed. He looked different, almost fragile, a stark contrast to the powerful image he had always projected. His usually sharp eyes were softened by fatigue, and the lines on his face seemed deeper, more vulnerable. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face as he recognized her. "Miss Johnson," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" Cora swallowed, offering a small, gentle smile. "I heard about what happened. I wanted to make sure you were all right." He chuckled weakly, the sound edged with bitterness. "So you came to check on the arrogant man who belittled you, humiliated you? Not many would bother." Cora shook her head, moving to the chair beside his bed. "You may have been harsh, sir, but I think there's more to you than what you show the world. Sometimes, we push people away because we're afraid to let them in. I understand that." He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face as though trying to read the sincerity in her words. "You always see more than I want anyone to see," he said finally, his tone carrying a hint of resignation. Cora sat quietly, letting the silence settle between them, comfortable and unhurried. She could see the toll that the years had taken on him, the weight of expectations and responsibilities pressing down on his shoulders. And she felt a deep empathy for him, a man who had spent his life building walls only to find himself alone within them. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. She nodded, her gaze steady as she waited for him to continue. Why didn't you just walk away after I treated you so poorly?" he asked, his voice raw with vulnerability. Why did you stay? Why did you care? Cora took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. Because, sir, I know what it's like to be judged without being understood, to be defined by one's circumstances, not one's heart. I stayed because I saw a part of myself in you, a person who is stronger than they realize, someone who's been hurt but keeps moving forward. And because, deep down, I knew that everyone deserves kindness, even those who may not ask for it. Blackwood's gaze softened, his expression one of quiet astonishment. He seemed to consider her words, a shadow of regret passing over his face. I don't deserve your kindness, Miss Johnson, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. I've spent my life taking more than I've given, surrounding myself with people who only see the power, the wealth. You're the first person who's looked at me and seen something else. Cora smiled, reaching out to place a comforting hand over his. We all have things we regret, sir. But that doesn't mean we can't change, that we can't choose to be better. A silence stretched between them, but it was a silence filled with understanding, a shared acknowledgement of their individual struggles and triumphs. In that moment, Cora realized that she was not just comforting him. She was reminding herself, too, of her own strength, her own resilience. He looked down at her hand resting atop his, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You know what he said, his voice soft. I think you're the first person in a long time who's made me feel human. She squeezed his hand gently. We're all human, sir. Some of us just need a reminder now and then. They spoke for hours, their conversation weaving through stories of their lives, their losses, their moments of quiet pride and heartbreak. Cora shared tales of her children, the years she had spent raising them alone after her husband's passing, the struggles she had endured to provide them with a life of dignity. And Blackwood, for the first time, shared pieces of his own past, of a father whose love was measured by success, of a life shaped by expectations he could never quite fulfill. By the time the conversation drew to a natural close, there was a sense of peace between them, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. Cora rose to leave, but as she reached the door, he called out to her. Miss Johnson. She turned, seeing a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. She smiled, her heart warmed by the sincerity in his words. Take care of yourself, Mr. Blackwood. And remember, life is more than what you build for yourself. It's who you build it with. With that, she left the room, her steps lighter, her spirit buoyed by the knowledge that she had, in some small way, helped him begin to heal. The following days passed quietly, but the memory of her conversation with Blackwood lingered, a reminder of the unexpected connection they had shared. Cora resumed her duties with renewed purpose, her heart filled with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years. One afternoon, as she was arranging fresh flowers in the hotel's main lobby, Mr. Thompson approached her, a faint smile playing on his usually stern face. Cora, you've received a commendation. From Mr. Blackwood, no less. Cora's eyes widened in surprise. A commendation. Mr. Thompson nodded, handing her a letter embossed with the hotel's seal. She unfolded it, her heart racing as she read the words inside. Blackwood's handwriting was unmistakable, the message simple yet profound. To Miss Cora Johnson, thank you for your kindness, your wisdom, and your strength. I have been changed by knowing you, and I am better for it. Please accept this as a small token of my gratitude. At the bottom of the letter was a note from the hotel's management, stating that she had been awarded a substantial raise, along with a promotion to a supervisory role within the housekeeping department. Cora's hand shook as she read the letter, the significance of it sinking in. She had worked her whole life in silence, her efforts unacknowledged, her worth often overlooked. But now, in the twilight of her career, she was finally seen, valued not just for her work, but for who she was. Tears pricked at her eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by a mix of joy and gratitude. She looked up, meeting Mr. Thompson's gaze, his usual stoicism softened with a rare expression of pride. "You've earned this, Cora," he said quietly. "You've more than earned it." Cora nodded, unable to speak as she wiped her tears. For the first time in her life, she felt truly valued, not only for her labor, but for the heart and wisdom she had carried with her through every challenge. And she knew that, though she would never wear a suit or command a boardroom, she had made an impact in ways that went beyond wealth or status. Weeks passed, and Cora settled into her new role with ease, the respect she commanded from her colleagues a testament to the quiet strength she had always carried. And while she rarely saw Blackwood, she heard whispers of his efforts to change, to rebuild relationships he had once neglected. One evening, as she prepared to leave, she found a small package waiting at the front desk with her name on it. Inside was a book, bound in rich leather, with a single note tucked inside the front cover. "Cora, thank you for showing me what it means to live with purpose. I hope to do the same, one step at a time. With gratitude, Reginald Blackwood." She traced her fingers over the words, a smile spreading across her face. It was a simple gift, but it carried a profound meaning. She had changed him, not through wealth or power, but through kindness, through patience, through the strength that only comes from a lifetime of resilience. As she walked out of the hotel that night, the city lights illuminating her path, she felt a quiet sense of pride, knowing that she had left her mark not just on the hotel, but on a life once hardened by isolation. And for Cora Johnson, the elderly maid who had lived in the shadows, it was enough. She had found her purpose, not in grandeur, but in the small, quiet moments that reminded her of her own worth, and in the courage to show someone else that even the hardest hearts could be softened by compassion.